Hey, Miss Sarika here for a study guide party! So let's kick it off and get started. All right, so this is for our life science quiz. So we're going to start off talking about some genetics. So the first question is talking about a flower having two different alleles for the color of its flowers. They could be purple or yellow, and you have to use this data table below and determine which allele is dominant and which one's going to be recessive. So remember that dominant means kind of not that it's stronger, but it's going to kind of mask over that other recessive allele if both are present. So when we look at the flowers being bred together, we get purple and a purple flower. The offspring are all purple. Yellow and yellow is all yellow. So those two facts in and of themselves don't really tell us too much, except that when we get to the purple and the yellow being bred together, all the flowers are yellow. Therefore, because that yellow is prevalent and it's going to show up over the purple, that's got to be the dominant allele. So that tells us that yellow is dominant and purple will be recessive. Now that gets us to our genotypes and phenotypes. So first of all, we need to select some sort of a letter to choose our allele. You could use anything. I've chosen to use Y, just because, why? Because it's yellow, it starts with a Y. But you could choose anything, it doesn't really matter, except that the dominant has to be the capital and recessive has to be the lowercase. So homogeneous, homozygous dominant and the genotype for that. So genotype means what the kind of this code is in the DNA. And the phenotype is going to be what that physically is going to appear as. So if it's homozygous dominant, homozygous means same, and dominant is telling us that they are both going to be dominant. So those are going to be a genotype of both capital Ys. Our phenotype is going to be presented as yellow. That means that the yellow color is going to be the dominant color being shown. Now we get to heterozygous, and heterozygous is when you have both a dominant and a recessive allele. So you have both of them. So in this case, we've got our capital Y and our lowercase y, and its phenotype, which is what it looks like, is going to be yellow again, because remember, dominant's going to show up over kind of masking that recessive allele, so we're only going to see the dominant one. All right, homozygous recessive, that's going to be the two little lowercase y's, and this phenotype will be purple. And purple is the only way that purple is going to show up and be presented is if both recessive alleles are there. Okay, so now we go into a little bit of reproduction. How many cells are at the end of these processes? Mitosis, you get 2. Meiosis, you get 4. So the basic idea is with mitosis, you start off with a cell, and it splits, and it makes 2 of the exact same cell. They're identical. So that's mitosis. Meiosis, you get this cell and it separates into 2, but then you need these gametes to be made. And the gametes are those sex cells, the sperm and the egg. Well, when we have those are only half the genetic material. So each of these, boop, splits into 2 separate cells, which gives you the 4. And now each of those has half the genetic material. And that's important because in sexual reproduction, you get half the genetic material from mom, half from dad, and they mix together to make the new organism. All right, so whoop. Now we look over here at this Punnett square over here. There's a Punnett square. So a species of bird has 2 different feather colors. The dominant allele is blue and the recessive allele is green. You're going to complete the Punnett square below for one parent that's heterozygous and one parent that has green feathers. So remember, heterozygous is when it has a dominant allele and a recessive allele. Hetero meaning different. So in the Punnett square up here, this is where we have our heterozygous parent. Now the next question is green feathers. Is that homozygous recessive or homozygous dominant? Well, it says that recessive allele is green, and so the recessive, the genotype is going to have both recessive alleles. So when you mix and cross your Punnett squares, these are the alleles that are presented. All right, so these are the genotypes here made of our separate alleles that have recombined to give us the probability of what the offspring's genetic makeup can be. All right, so now we need to look at, again, some more reproduction. We've got sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction, and we have to look at some of these characteristics. So mitosis. You're going to see mitosis connected to asexual reproduction. Meiosis is connected to sexual reproduction. But be careful because, well, one extra side note about asexual reproduction is that there are actually a lot of different ways that species reproduce asexually. Mitosis really isn't the way, but we associate it with asexual reproduction. In In sexual reproduction, we have meiosis, and meiosis creates the gametes that are used in sexual reproduction. So meiosis in and of itself is not sexual reproduction, but it's associated with it. Okay, needing genetic info from two parents, sexual reproduction, although there are some species like plants that can actually reproduce sexually with their own gametes, so they actually don't need two different organisms, which is kind of cool. Needing only one parent is asexual. Being identical to the parent is going to be asexual reproduction. Being unique from the parent is sexual. And that's important because in sexual reproduction, you get a ton of diversity. I mean, you can look around, the planet, just humans alone, we're a single species. And there's a ton of diversity, both physically and just how our bodies process things. And so it's an important advantage, which we'll get to in a second, for sexual reproduction, that we have tons of diversity. All right, taking longer, that's sexual reproduction, while asexual is usually shorter. Requiring more resources is sexual reproduction, but it also allows for more mutations and variation. And then these last two are both asexual. If the parent can survive in the environment, the offspring will likely survive too. So think about like a pond with bacteria. If the parent is able to survive in that little pond with whatever conditions there are, temperature and everything, then all of the offspring, because they're identical, they're going to also be able to survive, and that kind of is advantageous to them. Now, on the other side, though, if the parent is threatened and the offspring are identical, which they are in asexual reproduction, then the offspring are going to be threatened just as much as the parent. So that gets to this part, which I didn't already have done, so let's do it together. Okay, so we have to put a circle if it seems like it would be a disadvantage, and put a star if it seems like an advantage, and leave it alone if it's just a fact. So mitosis, meiosis, those are just facts. That's nothing really special. Needing genetic information from two parents, you might want to consider that possibly a disadvantage because that can be challenging for a species, especially if they live someplace isolated or if there just aren't a lot of those species available. So needing only one parent, we could see that as an advantage. Being identical and unique from the parent. Again, those kind of could be neutral because it kind of could go both ways. But something important, I'll say unique from the parent, there's a lot of benefit to having that diversity. So I would call that one as an advantage. Taking longer would be a disadvantage. Being shorter would be an advantage. Requiring more resources, definitely a disadvantage. But this is where this is going to be good. More likely to have variation. That's awesome because the species now has more opportunity to survive when the environment might change. All right, if the parent can survive, oh no, we don't need that. Okay, when the parent can survive and the offspring can too, advantage. And over here would be a disadvantage, being identical and having that likelihood of also being threatened by whatever was threatening the parent. Okay, so let's kind of wrap it up over here. All right, this question, sorry, it's kind of weird. I guess you kind of had to guess what was in my head. So a fossil of a bird was found next to a fossil of some several leaves. What could you conclude about the environment at the time when the fossil was made? At its most basic level, the bird lived in a place with trees. Pretty simple. I wanted you just to kind of get the gist that when you look at the fossils and you look at the rocks, that they're going to inform you about what was happening on Earth at the time. You could have gone further to say, some people suggested, well, what if both the leaves and the animal died at the same time? So maybe there was some sort of mass extinction. Also a valid answer. But at its most base level, just understand that fossils and rocks and things can indicate what is happening at Earth at the time that those things were created. All right, number 6. Bear with me because I made a silly mistake. So in a desert, there's a specific type of plant that can have brown stems or green stems. Over a short period of time, the climate changed. The rainfall used to be about 10 inches a year, but with the change in climate, it's increased to about 100 inches a year. This has caused a lot of plants with green leaves to increase in number. So what will best fit the situation? Obviously, the number of green plants will increase because I said it already, so that was me not really paying attention. So hopefully you have that one circled. But this one down here you may not have had circled, that the climate changed the environment, or the climate changed the environment the plants were living in, and the plants will have to change to continue to survive. That's also true, and that's kind of the foundation behind the process of evolution. All right, last but not least, it's all about reading this graph, and why is that not unclicking? Oh well, we'll have to deal with it. All right, so looking at this graph and identifying some things about the survival of this species, extinction, and just being able to interpret the data. So first, what species still exists in the present? So if you look here, the present is up at the top and millions of years ago, so it's older and older and older farther down. Which ones still exist in the present? Well, here's the present. Let's follow along. That's Group A, Group C, and Group D. Simple enough. All right, which one went extinct? Well, Group B here started a little earlier than 20 million years, or earlier than 20 million years ago, and ended about 10 million years ago, and there's nothing else beyond that, so that one went extinct. Sorry, Group B. Okay, Group C, which species has a consistent number of organisms? Well, Group D here is about the same width, and if you read up here, it says skinnier equals less number of species, and wider is more number. So we would interpret this data that, I mean, they had a little bit of a reduction in numbers there, but overall, it was pretty consistent. And D, which one had a major growth in the present day? Group A, you can see kind of splits off there and it gets a lot wider, which indicates that there was a major growth in number of population. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, come find me, and I hope you had fun at our study guide party.